The year was 1921. The month was November. And in the Arkansas Ozarks, a chill had begun to settle deep within the bones of the land. This was Newton County, a place of rugged beauty and profound isolation. Here, ancient limestone bluffs stood like silent sentinels, their faces weathered by time and secrets. Below them, dense forests of hickory and oak sprawled across the rolling hills, their leaves turning to brittle shades of rust and gold. The air itself seemed to carry the weight of the coming winter, a crisp, biting cold that promised long nights and a deep, unyielding quiet. It was a place where nature, not man, made the rules. This was a landscape that did not give up its secrets easily. The terrain was treacherous, a maze of deep hollows, winding creeks, and hidden caves carved into the very stone of the earth. People who lived here knew the land had a memory. Stories were passed down not in books, but in hushed tones around crackling fires. Tales of strange lights in the woods, of disappearances that were never solved, of places where the veil between worlds felt unnervingly thin. In the autumn of 1921, the woods were particularly still, the silence broken only by the rustle of dry leaves underfoot or the distant call of a lone hawk circling high above the canopy. For the scattered residents of this remote corner of Arkansas, life was a constant negotiation with the elements. Communities were small, separated by miles of unforgiving wilderness. A trip to the nearest town could be an all-day affair, a journey undertaken only when necessary. People relied on themselves, on their knowledge of the seasons, and on the bounty the forest provided. They were a hardy, self-sufficient folk, accustomed to solitude and wary of outsiders. They understood that the Ozarks held both sustenance and danger, and they respected the boundaries, both seen and unseen, that the ancient hills imposed upon them. It was into this world, on a particularly cold morning, with the sky the color of slate, that our story begins. The date was November 20th, 1925. A day like any other, or so it seemed. The wind whispered through the skeletal branches of the trees, carrying with it the earthy scent of decay and damp soil. It was the kind of day that encouraged people to stay indoors, to stoke the fire, and wait for the sun to burn through the persistent gloom. But one man was not indoors. He was out in the wilderness, moving through it as if he were a part of it, unaware that he was about to stumble upon a mystery that would haunt these hills for a century to come. That man was Ezra Holloway. He was not like the others in Newton County. While many were born to these hills, Ezra had been forged by the fires of a world far away. A veteran of the Great War, he had seen things in the trenches of France that had changed him forever. The noise, the chaos, the constant presence of death. It had stripped something away from him, leaving behind a man who sought solace not in the company of others, but in the profound silence of the wilderness. He returned to the Ozarks a different person, his eyes holding a distant, haunted look that kept most people at arm's length. He was a solitary figure, more comfortable with the rhythms of the forest than the small talk of town. His life was one of deliberate routine and isolation. Ezra lived in a small, rustic cabin he had built himself, nestled deep in a hollow far from the main road. He was a hunter and a trapper, skills he had honed since boyhood and perfected through the harsh lessons of survival. His days were spent walking the ridgelines and valleys, his old Winchester rifle a familiar weight in his hands. He knew the land intimately, every game trail, every spring, every hidden nook and cranny. The locals regarded him with a mixture of respect and suspicion. They respected his abilities, his uncanny knack for navigating the dense woods, but they were unnerved by his reclusiveness. He was a ghost in his own community. Ezra's reputation was that of a man who saw things others missed. He could read the forest like a book, noticing the slightest disturbance, a broken twig, an unusual track, a change in the wind. This hyper-awareness was a remnant of his time in the war, a survival instinct that had never been turned off. He moved through the woods with a quiet, patient purpose, his senses on high alert. He wasn't just looking for game. He was observing, listening, feeling the pulse of the wild. This connection to the land was his anchor, the one thing that seemed to quiet the echoes of the past that still rang in his ears. He was a man apart, defined by the war he had left behind and the wilderness he had embraced. On that November morning, Ezra was tracking a deer, his movements slow and deliberate. The air was cold enough to see his breath, a small white cloud that vanished into the gray stillness. He was miles from his cabin, deep in a section of the Boston Mountains he knew well, yet one he hadn't explored in several months. He felt at peace here, the familiar weight of his pack and the cold steel of his rifle a comforting presence. He had no way of knowing that his unparalleled knowledge of this very land, the source of his comfort, was about to lead him to a discovery that would shatter his hard-won tranquility and plunge him back into a world of darkness he thought he had escaped. As the day wore on, something changed. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. A shift in the wind brought a new scent to Ezra's nostrils. It was not the familiar smell of damp earth, decaying leaves, or pine. This was something else entirely, something unnatural. It was faint, carried on the intermittent breeze that swirled through the hollows, but it was deeply unsettling. He paused, lifting his head and sniffing the air like an animal sensing danger. The deer he had been tracking was forgotten. His focus shifted entirely to this new, intrusive element in his domain. The odor was cloying, a strange mix of sweet and foul that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it away. Perhaps it was a dead animal, a deer or a boar, that had met its end somewhere in the dense underbrush. He had encountered the smell of death in the woods countless times before. But this was different. There was a chemical sharpness to it, an acrid undertone that didn't belong in nature. It was a smell that reminded him, with a sudden sickening jolt, of the battlefields of Europe. It was a memory he had tried to bury, the unforgettable odor of things man-made and things left to rot. Driven by a grim curiosity he couldn't explain, he began to follow the scent, moving upwind. The smell grew stronger as he pushed deeper into a narrow, rocky ravine he rarely visited. The terrain became more difficult, the ground littered with sharp limestone rocks and tangled roots. The air grew colder here, shielded from the weak afternoon sun. The odor was now thick, almost suffocating, clinging to the damp air. It seemed to be emanating from a dark cleft in the face of a limestone bluff, an opening partially concealed by a thicket of wild briars. It was not a large opening, just a dark slit in the rock, a place one could easily walk past 100 times without ever noticing. A place that seemed to want to remain hidden. Hesitantly, Ezra approached the fissure in the rock. The smell was now overwhelming, a gag-inducing miasma that promised something terrible within. He stood there for a long moment, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. Every instinct, honed by years in the wilderness and on the front lines, screamed at him to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But the mystery was too powerful. What could possibly create such a uniquely horrifying scent? Taking a deep breath of the cleaner air behind him, he steeled himself, pushed aside the thorny branches, and peered into the suffocating darkness of the hidden cave. He was not prepared for what he was about to see. The darkness inside the cave was absolute. After the gray light of the November afternoon, Ezra was momentarily blind. But his other senses were on fire. The odor was a physical presence, a foul wall of air that seemed to push back at him. He fumbled in his pack for his kerosene lantern, his hands shaking slightly as he struck a match. The small flame flickered to life, casting a weak, dancing glow that did little to pierce the oppressive blackness. He held the lantern forward, stepping cautiously across the threshold. The floor of the cave was uneven, slick with moisture. The silence in here was different from the silence of the woods. It was a dead, suffocating quiet. As his eyes adjusted, the lantern's glow began to reveal the cave's secrets. It was not a large chamber, maybe no more than 20 feet deep. The walls were wet, glistening with calcite deposits that looked like frozen tears in the flickering light. And then he saw it. In the far corner of the cave, arranged in a way that defied any natural explanation, were human remains. Not just a single skeleton, but what appeared to be parts of several. They were laid out on a flat ledge of rock with a bizarre, almost ceremonial precision. Skulls were placed in a neat row, and long bones were stacked like firewood. It was a scene of such calculated strangeness that it seemed to mock the very idea of a peaceful rest. But it was not just the arrangement that was horrifying. The bones themselves were wrong. They were coated in a strange, waxy substance that seemed to have preserved them in an unnatural state. It was this substance, he realized with a wave of nausea, that was the source of the terrible smell. It was a chemical preservative of some kind, something he had never encountered before. Scattered around the remains were other objects: glass jars containing murky liquids, strange surgical-looking tools of brass and steel, and stacks of what looked like leather-bound journals. It was a laboratory of the macabre, hidden deep within the earth. For a long moment, Ezra could only stare, his mind struggling to process the grotesque tableau before him. This was not the work of an animal. It was not an old burial ground. This was something else. Something deliberate, methodical, and deeply disturbed. The hunter, the soldier, the man who thought he had seen the worst of humanity, stood frozen in the flickering lamplight. He had stumbled upon a secret that had been carefully hidden, a private, gruesome obsession tucked away in the heart of the Ozarks. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that he had to get out. He had to tell someone. He backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving the display, and fled back into the cold, clean air of the forest. When Ezra Holloway finally reached the small town of Jasper and found Sheriff Martin Webb, his story tumbled out in a torrent of fragmented, breathless sentences. The sheriff, a man accustomed to dealing with moonshiners and property disputes, listened with growing disbelief. Ezra was known for his solitude, not for flights of fancy. His distress was palpable, his face pale and drawn. "It wasn't natural, Martin," Ezra reportedly told him, his voice low and strained. "The smell, it was like nothing from this earth. And the bones, they were laid out, like a collection, like someone was studying them. There were tools, jars. It was a devil's workshop in there." Sheriff Webb, accompanied by a local doctor and 2 deputies, followed Ezra back into the remote hollows the next day. The journey itself was an ordeal, a testament to the cave's isolation. When they finally arrived, the sheriff understood Ezra's horror. The official report, later filed in the county records, was written in a tone of stark confusion and fear. Sheriff Webb wrote, "The odor that met us at the mouth of the cave was of a most foul and indescribable nature. Inside, we discovered what can only be described as a grotesque exhibition of human remains. The bones, which appeared to be from no fewer than 3 individuals, were coated in a waxy, chemical-smelling substance. The scene was not one of burial, but of assembly. Medical experts who were later consulted were equally baffled. Dr. Alistair Finch, who examined some of the bone fragments, noted the strange preservative. "I've never seen anything like it," his testimony stated. "It's not embalming fluid as we know it. It has preserved the bone tissue to a remarkable degree, but has also permeated it with this pungent, waxy residue. Furthermore, some of the bones bear markings consistent with fine-toothed saws or other precise cutting instruments. This was not the work of a madman in a frenzy. This was meticulous, patient, and deeply disturbing work." The lack of answers only deepened the mystery and fueled a quiet panic in the community. The official investigation quickly hit a wall. Who were the victims? No one had been reported missing from the immediate area for years. Who was the collector? The journals found in the cave were filled with dense, unreadable script and complex anatomical drawings, but they offered no name, no clue to the author's identity. Law enforcement was at a complete loss. Their testimonies from the time reflect a sense of being completely out of their depth. One deputy was quoted in a local paper as saying, "It feels like we disturbed something that was meant to stay hidden forever. Something ancient and wrong. I don't think we'll ever know the truth of what was happening in that cave." What made the discovery even more unsettling was Ezra Holloway himself. This was not a man easily frightened. His experiences in the war had exposed him to the absolute depths of human brutality. He had seen death in all its forms, from the sudden violence of an artillery shell to the slow, agonizing decay of the trenches. He was trained to observe, to notice details that others would overlook. His knowledge of the land was second to none. He knew the difference between a natural death in the wild and something orchestrated by a human hand. And what he saw in that cave, he later told the sheriff, was the work of a human hand that was far more terrifying than anything he had witnessed in the war. Ezra's familiarity with the Ozark wilderness made the location of the cave all the more disturbing. It was not in a place one would happen upon by chance. It was deliberately chosen for its remoteness, its inaccessibility. "You'd have to know these hills like the back of your hand to find that spot," he explained to the deputies. "And you'd have to be strong enough to haul things up there. Equipment, bodies. It took effort. It took planning." For Ezra, the chilling implication was that the person responsible was not some stranger passing through, but someone who knew these woods as well as he did. Someone who could move through them without leaving a trace. The methodical nature of the scene was what truly haunted him. In the chaos of war, death was random and senseless. But this was the opposite. The neat rows of skulls, the stacked bones, the carefully arranged tools, it spoke of a cold, detached intelligence. It was like a museum, Ezra struggled to explain. A private, sick museum. In the war, men killed out of fear or duty. This was for something else. This was for pleasure, maybe, or for some kind of knowledge I don't want to understand. The soldier in him recognized the discipline, the patience, the meticulous planning. And it was this recognition that filled him with a profound sense of dread. This unique perspective made Ezra's discovery all the more credible and all the more terrifying to the authorities. He wasn't just a spooked hunter who had stumbled upon an old grave. He was a seasoned observer, a veteran who understood the mechanics of death and survival. His testimony carried weight. If Ezra Holloway said that something was profoundly wrong, people listened. He had seen the organized chaos of war, but the cold, silent organization within that cave represented a different, more personal kind of evil. An evil that could live and work, unnoticed, for years, right there in the heart of their quiet, isolated community. In the weeks and months that followed, a veil of official secrecy descended upon the case. Sheriff Webb, facing a mystery with no leads and no answers, sealed the records. The cave was dynamited shut, a drastic measure to ensure no one else would ever stumble upon its gruesome contents. The official explanation given to the public was vague. An old, unmarked burial site had been found and properly dealt with. But those who knew the details, the few deputies and the doctor who had been to the scene, knew the truth was far more complex and sinister. They stopped talking about it, at least in public. The story became another Ozark whisper, a chilling tale told in hushed tones. The effect on those directly involved was profound and lasting. Ezra Holloway, the man who had sought peace in the silence of the woods, became even more withdrawn. The discovery had breached his sanctuary, proving that the horrors of man could reach him even in the deepest wilderness. He was rarely seen in town after that, his solitary walks taking him to different, less tainted parts of the mountains. It was as if the memory of that chemical scent and the sight of those collected bones had poisoned his connection to the land. The woods were no longer just a place of solace. They were now a place that could hold the darkest of human secrets. The case of the Bone Cave of Newton County was never solved. The identity of the victims, the purpose of the strange preservative, and the name of the macabre collector remain lost to time. The leather-bound journals, with their unreadable script, offered no confession and no explanation. They were sent away to experts who, according to rumor, were never able to decipher their contents. The mystery simply faded into the fabric of local legend, a chilling reminder that not all questions have answers, and not all evils are brought to justice. It became a story that parents told their children to keep them from wandering too far into the woods, and so the Ozark Hills keep their secrets. Even today, on a cold November evening when the wind blows just right, one might wonder what other hidden places lie tucked away in those remote hollows. What other stories are buried beneath the soil and stone? The case of Ezra Holloway's discovery serves as an enduring, chilling question. It reminds us that even in the most beautiful and tranquil landscapes, a deep darkness can be hiding just beneath the surface, waiting in a silent cave, its secrets sealed not by a door, but by time, fear, and the profound, enduring quiet of the wilderness itself.